Um, okay, we'll dive in and talk a little bit about mythology on information security. First, here's a little bit of information about me and how to contact me. I'm certainly not up here to tell you that I have all the answers about the topics we're going to talk about today. I'd like this to be the first part of a conversation, and so please reach out to me with comments or questions if you don't have a chance to do it today, and I do think we'll have time for questions at the end. Then here's some various ways to contact me. We'd love for this to be a part of a longer-term conversation with all of you. I do ask that you hold off on any comments or questions until the end of the talk. Like I say, I think we'll have plenty of time for that, but I want to make sure that we get through all 6 myths. So we'll go ahead and get started. One common thread that's going to run through all 6 of these myths is that the words we use matter. As professionals in the industry, we owe it to ourselves and the others and to our audience to choose words wisely. And the words that we use impact our attitudes, they impact our actions, and more importantly, they impact the attitudes and actions of our audience. And so we need to be careful and thoughtful about the words that we use and what that meaning that conveys. So myth number 1, there is such a thing as security. We call ourselves information security professionals. We've seen the word security thrown around a lot at this conference, but is there such a thing, and do we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice by using the term so freely? So we'll talk a little bit about that, and I have to warn you, this myth will take longer than all the others because it really gets to the heart of what we do and who we are. So a couple of examples I want to run through. The first one's parenting, to talk about the myth of security and how it impacts us. So most new parents know instinctively that their number 1 job is to protect this new defenseless creature that they have responsibility for. And it's true. Our job as parents, our most important job is to provide safety to our children, right? Is that generally correct? Of course it is. And that's why we all wrap our children in bubble wrap and lock them in their rooms and would never let them do anything crazy like play sports or ride in a car, because those things are statistically dangerous. We can absolutely show that if your child plays sports, they're likely to get hurt at some point. And yet we let our kids do all sorts of dangerous things. In fact, I think in that picture in the upper left-hand corner, the kid's actually putting his hand in fire and some adults taking a picture instead of stopping him. But somehow we allow that to happen. And the reason is that our instincts are wrong. That in fact, we don't have the primary job of providing security. It's a definite component. But if we take that to an extreme, we can do our children disservice. We deny them a lot of the opportunities that they might otherwise have. And so security, though we think it may be our objective, really isn't. Our objective is more to find a balance for our children's lives, and we'll see that as a theme throughout this. Let's see if we can find another example of where the word security leads us to maybe a bad path. So global security agencies. There's a huge civil rights debate going on, not just in the U.S., but around many parts of the world right now on privacy versus security. And we hear it more in our industry than in others, but it's certainly become a topic for popular press as well. And to be honest, I feel for these agencies. The conversation generally goes something like this. Citizens say, there's all these horrible things in the world, and these things are absolutely horrible. Governments protect us from these horrible things. Protect us no matter what, give us security. And governments create these security agencies, and these security agencies say, okay, to secure you absolutely, I need to be able to get all of your data, I need a giant portion of your GDP, and then maybe we can do something about security. And the fact is, the conversation gets off to the wrong start because we're focused on security. Absolute security isn't possible. We live in a dangerous world, and as horrible as these things are, there's nothing that any government can do to absolutely guarantee our safety from them. And so if we start from a different path, if we start the conversation not about we need security, but about we need some sort of balance between funds that we're able to provide, between privacy and between safety, and that this is actually a balancing act, then it becomes a more useful conversation. We end up more in sync with the security agencies that we're working with. So really there's 2 problems with the word security. The first is that it puts the group in charge of security at odds with whoever's asking for it, because rarely when someone asks for security is it actually what they want. Really what they want is some sort of balance between taking risks and some benefit that those risks might provide. And the other problem with using the word security is that it's absolutely impossible. We do live in a dangerous world, and none of us can provide security. We can't provide security as parents, as governments, and not as information security professionals. So really what we're looking for is a balance. And so is there a term that's better to talk about, to imply that what we're looking for is this balance, and to admit from the very beginning of the conversation that security isn't possible? Could it be risk management? You bet it is. And so all this applies to information security as well. It applies to us in the technology risk realm. We put ourselves at odds with businesses whenever we try and take our role as security too seriously. I know when I was a new security professional, newly ordained, pulled in from a software development job and told, you're now in charge of security for this organization. I thought, okay, great, I'll start making decisions to help secure the organization. And so I started telling people no when they started taking risks that I thought were going too far. And I was the decision maker. And quickly the CIO started referring to the department as the Department of No. Engineers and developers started to try and work around us instead of work with us because we said no instead of being partners in a relationship. And then I realized that this isn't my decision. I'm not the decision maker here. And I can't enforce the will. And the company actually doesn't want absolute security. Companies take risks naturally. That's what they do. That's how they make money. And so even though they might declare that we're the security people and the senior business, they think that they want absolute security, when they actually understand that the costs involved, that's not really what they want. What they want is some sort of risk management. They want to find that balance between being able to take educated and informed risks and some level of safety. So we talked a little bit about risk management. I want to take a little bit of time to go through the risk management process. And for any of you that were in Karen Liu and Josh Sokol's talk yesterday, this will kind of amplify some of what they talked about. I take it from a little bit different perspective, but a lot of the same bullet points we're going to hit. So there's many different types of risk management processes. This is the one that we've implemented at the company I'm at now, and it works for me. I think that with slight changes, this works for most organizations. So let's run through it. So first role in risk management is to identify the risk. And also, and I should have explicitly put it up there, to assess the risk. And I think this naturally comes to us as information security professionals. This is what we do anyway. There's not much difference here between information security and risk management. But in the next step, here's where we start to diverge a little bit. So historically in the information security realm, we feel like it's our job to address the risk. And so we go off and we implement controls, or we stop software releases, or we do whatever we need to in order to mitigate risk. But I propose as risk managers, our job is to advise and to become trusted advisors within our organization and work with the actual decision makers in deciding which way we need to go in order to address risk. So we need to focus on the advise as opposed to the address. So how do we advise people to address risk? There's 4 options, and I'll run through them really quick. I think most of you are pretty familiar with them. The first is to avoid risk. Most of the time, avoiding risk involves working through processes. It's process re-engineering. The classic example, and unfortunately one that we've seen before, is you work with a vendor who's going to send out mailers to your customers, and so they ask for a feed of your customer list. You're looking through the feed that they ask for, and they ask for social security number. Why do you need social security number to send out a mailer? Well, we just needed a unique ID to identify everybody. Okay, I'm not going to use social security number. We'll send you something different. And simply by changing that one little thing, by doing a slight re-engineering of that business process, you can completely avoid a risk. Reduced risk comes, for me, the more enjoyable part. This is really where we get technical. This is where we're hardening our systems. This is where we're identifying bugs in our software and working with developers to plug those holes. So generally reducing risk implies applying some sort of technical control. It's also implementing new software, or new software that provides controls, new tools. Transfer risk, so this is the rare one. It's the really only valid example I've ever heard is purchasing cybersecurity insurance. It's made more at a corporate level. It's not something that applies on risk that you really see on a day-to-day basis. The only thing worth mentioning on transfer risk is that it should never be confused with outsourcing. Outsourcing does not transfer risk to the outsourced party. You still maintain that risk. If something goes wrong, your customers still associate the data with you, not with whoever you outsource something to. So that's something to be careful of. And then last, accept risk. And as information security professionals, we just always, this nod at me when people are willing to accept risk. It just always seemed insane to me. But as a risk management professional, there's a lot of reasons to accept risk. And the most common one is that we don't have the staff or the budget right now to address it. And when we don't, maybe because we're working on higher priority risks. And it's part of our responsibility to be trusted advisors and advise honestly on risk and recognize the limitations of our companies when it comes to staffing and to resources. And so it may make sense to say, okay, we don't have the resources to address this now. How about in 6 months? Let's set a date. Let's set a goal. And then we accept the risk, but only for a short time period, something that we can all agree on. And we can negotiate that, and we can push to make it aggressive and reasonable. But there's plenty of cases where it makes sense to accept risk for some period of time. But accepting risk really doesn't end there, because the other role that we have as risk managers is not only to allow groups to accept risk, but to make sure that the right individuals within the company are accepting risk. And so take the example of we have a division manager that's committed to roll out a new product. It's going to be a piece of software that sits in the DMZ, customer facing. And we test it, and a week before it's supposed to roll out, we find out that it's got enough holes for a truck to roll through. It's just a security nightmare. And so we take this back to the division manager, and he says, we've committed to our customers, we've committed to our investors, I'm willing to accept this risk. The problem in that scenario is that if somebody ends up owning that server, then they can use that as a foothold to get to the rest of the DMZ, to get to the rest of the organization. That's not a risk for that division manager to make. It's our role as risk professionals to escalate that to the proper level in the organization, to make sure that someone who has that broader view of the whole risk to the company gets an opportunity to be the ones to make that risk acceptance decision. And so what we find in a lot of cases is that when we escalate to the proper level in the organization, all of a sudden there's a little bit more hesitancy to accept a risk. And so a lot of times we'll get sent back to that advised category, and people are a little bit more open to re-engineering business processes, a little bit more open to invest in new controls, a little bit more open to push back a release for another week or two to at least fix the highest priority bugs. And so that escalation process is absolutely key to the risk management process as a whole. But we're not done there. So even if we've completely addressed the risk by some combination, and I don't know that I mentioned that these different ways of addressing risk and advise, they're not mutually exclusive. A lot of times we address risk by some combination of the four. But when we implement controls, either through process re-engineering or implementing a technical control or even purchasing insurance, we need something in place to monitor that control. Its effectiveness, the simple truth is the effectiveness of controls, if they're unwatched, will degrade over time. It just happens. Businesses change, people stop watching it. Somehow that control is going to become defective. And so what we need to do is, as we are initially in that advise phase, we need to be honest advisors and incorporate the costs of monitoring into the control that we propose. And monitoring ideally needs to be, whenever possible, something that's continuous and automated. We don't want to have people checking on manual processes. We don't want to have people manually running through logs. We want something that's going to automatically alert us. And so the cost of implementing that, it's a little bit high up front, but it pays off over the time, and we need to make sure that that cost and that time frame is incorporated into any controls that we agree to with our clients. And then finally, renewal of risks. I already mentioned that when risks are accepted, very often they're accepted for a fixed time frame. That's important because we hope to put some mitigation in place, but there are times where risks are accepted without a mitigation plan. Those risks, especially the high risks, need to have expiration dates. Those risks shouldn't be able to go on forever. Companies' appetite for risk changes over time. Senior management changes. Business conditions change. And so particularly for any high risks that are accepted, those need to have some type of expiration associated with it. We need to go back for a new risk acceptance. And many cases, because conditions have changed, we'll find that it's a good time to go ahead and try and address other ways, or find other ways to address this risk. And then the last part of the process, but really something that needs to go throughout the whole process, is that we have to track these risks from the point where we first identify them, to where we assess the severity, to where we work with our clients to find solutions to how to address it, we need to track them. So we need some type of risk register in our organization, and that's absolutely key. And so just a little bit of a plug for Josh. Anyone that doesn't already have some type of risk register, Simple Risk is a great free tool that's available, and you can find it on the bag that you got when you checked in here. But there's plenty of other tools out there. The commercial ones tend to be a little bit pricey. If you can afford it, great. But if not, there's a perfectly usable free tool available out there. But whatever you do, even if it's just spreadsheets, track the risk that you identify. So to sum up here, information security, it leads us astray. It sets us up with an impossible mission and leaves us frustrated at the end of the day because people are going to accept risks and they're not going to let you secure the organization the ways that you think it should be. And there's just not enough bubble wrap to protect that baby, no matter how much we add. But at the end of the day, risk management gives us a path to find that balance, the right balance for the organization, because all organizations need to accept risk. And if we follow a solid risk management process, then it helps us find what the right level of risk acceptance is for our companies. Okay, myth number 2, there's a cyber war going on. So this one drives me a little bit nuts, and unfortunately it's going to drive me even more nuts as tensions raise between Russia and the US over the DNC and other cyber attacks. And I guess it doesn't bother me too much that we've come over the last few years to add the word cyber to just about any type of verb or noun that we can find anywhere. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not. But I think that we need to be careful to pay attention to the meaning of the root word whenever we add cyber to it. We shouldn't lose meaning whenever we add that. And so we'll run through a few words that we often add cyber to, and let's take a look at what the root word really means and try and make sure that we as professionals continue to keep fidelity with that meaning as we use the word in the cyber context. So this is war. It's death on massive scales. It's an absolutely horrific event. And so when I hear cyber war, this is what I think of, and it's not what we see in our day-to-day lives. Certainly there are smart bombs and smart bullets, but it's ultimately bullets and bombs that kill people in wars. It's not computers. And so even though we use computers more and more in warfare, I think the term cyber war should mean something a little bit different. And I think that we devalue the word war when we when we use cyber war so freely. All of a sudden we become numb to it as a society, and we think that cyber war is something that we can accept or ignore, or that's just commonplace and unavoidable. It's a dangerous path. I'd much rather leave the term for something that's much more monumental than how we're using it today. Assassination. So I occasionally hear the words cyber assassination thrown about. And you might be able to call it drone strike and assassination, but it's really, in the end, like I said, it's a bullet or bomb that's causing the damage. It's not computers. There's been some very interesting research in attacks on medical devices or vehicles that could potentially be used in some type of assassination attempt. I'd buy that as a cyber assassination, but right now, luckily, it's more theoretical than it is reality. And so again, this is a word that we need to be a little bit careful with when we add cyber to it so that we don't distort the meaning. Propaganda. So this is an area where I can understand the use of the phrase cyber propaganda a little bit better. Islamic State's been extremely successful in using social media to recruit and to spread the propaganda. And so we see this more and more. It's something that we absolutely, as security professionals, as risk professionals, need to be aware of and need to be prepared to combat. And so cyber propaganda gets us closer to the realm of where I think we need to be in phrasing. And then espionage, spying, stealing information. 99.9% of the time when I see the phrase cyber war or cyber assassination, what we're really talking about is cyber espionage. And I think, again, as security professionals, as risk professionals, we should be careful in the words that we use. And I'd love to see us use cyber espionage much more and replace cyber war with it. It's a much more honest telling of and description of what we're talking about. And then sometimes we add cyber to something, it's just a failed TV show and very disappointing. So to sum up, cyber war, we haven't seen one yet. We shouldn't talk about it like it's a real thing or something that exists. It might come about someday, I hope not. But we should still use the word with a little bit of hesitancy. We should use it with a little bit of reverence, and we should use it as something that we should absolutely avoid. It's not something commonplace, because words matter. The next two we'll take together. It's all about authentication. Myth 3, the password is dead. I hear that a lot. And then I also hear people talk about two factors as it necessarily solves every authentication problem that they've ever come across. And so I want to talk about these a little bit and dive in a little bit more deeply. First, just the quick recap. I'm sure you all know there's traditionally three factors of authentication: something you know, something you have, something that you are. Lots of talk about a fourth or fifth factor, where you are, or how you behave. That gets into semantics that we won't dive into today. Let's stick with the three factors. They're traditional. So password is dead. We hear that all the time. It's plenty of press declares it. Lots of vendors say that their product kills passwords, and really when I look at those products at the heart of them, somewhere at an administrative level, there's usually a password. They may be able to keep end users away from passwords a little bit. They may be able to distract from passwords, but certainly you can't call the password dead at the same time you release a product that uses passwords. And so I think we need to be a little bit careful there. But passwords do have a lot of problems. I don't want to gloss over the subject. You make them long enough so that they can't be easily brute forced, and then users can't remember them, and then you make it worse by making them change it all the time, and so they write it on a Post-it note. All the problems that everybody complains about are absolutely true. But before we declare the password dead, we need to think a little bit about what our alternatives are and make sure that we have solid alternatives at hand. So let's look at our other factors. Something that you have. So something you have actually started out, the first time I heard about it, it was sheets of paper with random numbers printed on them. And so when you'd log into a system, you'd look at the next random number, type it in, scratch it off so that you know the next time you looked at the next number on that sheet of paper. Obviously very cumbersome and error prone. RSA changed things and made it all more commonplace with the secure ID. Most of us remember those devices and had them at some point. Some of us probably still do. The one problem with secure IDs, or one of the problems with secure IDs, was that because you only used it when you authenticated, you'd leave it at home on your nightstand half the time because you didn't need it for anything else. And so we started moving to SMS messages. It was nice. You almost always carried your phone with you. We're much more cognizant of that. Of course, SMS isn't encrypted, and a lot of people have SMS text show up on their phone even when the screen's locked, so there's some problems with that. So then we moved on to phone apps, and that's a much better solution. We do actually remember to carry our phones with us most of the time, and with the apps we can address the screen lock problem, the encryption problem. That helps. But the inherent problems with something that you have, just like passwords, can't be avoided, no matter what technology we use. You can absolutely lose it, and the bigger problem is someone else can obtain it. And no matter what you do with something you have, those two problems exist. And we can mitigate those risks, but they will always exist. So just like passwords, something you have, or just not like something you know, something you have comes with some inherent limitations. Biometrics. We have to give biometrics a lot of credit. I remember not too many years ago thinking that it was pie in the sky and that we'd never see it, and now every one of us logs into our phones constantly using almost solely biometrics. They've definitely come a long way. They're much more effective than they used to be. They're much more usable. They're much more cost effective. But biometrics also come with some inherent problems. First of all, there's this constant arms race. As good as they are, they're certainly not perfect. It started out as fingerprint readers on laptops that you could bypass with a little bit of Scotch tape pretty easily, and now the fingerprint readers are better. But there's still plenty of ways of bypassing fingerprint readers in most of our phones that you can find out on the internet. Every time I see a publication about a great new biometric technique that either lowers costs or introduces a new method, I a few months later see a security researcher that's found a way around it. And so we have to recognize that there's an arms race with biometrics, and you can't necessarily bet on it because there's still a lot of work being done there. The other problem with biometrics is, how do you reset your fingerprint? If I lose my password, I can reset that. If I lose my phone, I can cancel it and get another one. But if I lose control over my fingerprint or my iris or retinal images or my DNA, how do I get that back? How do I reset that? How do I get control over it again? And so that's another concern that we need to keep in mind with biometrics. And so all three of our traditional factors have inherent problems. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't use them. We have to. They're the only options that we have. But it does mean that we need to be a little bit careful. But then as an industry, we decided, okay, so if all three factors have these inherent problems that we can't get away from, then we'll just combine them. That solves all the problems, right? And so we'll just use multi-factor. And multi-factor fixes everything. But does it? I'd suggest that there's two problems with declaring that multi-factor solves all of the authentication issues. The first problem is that that every time we use authentication, it depends on how you implement the factors. If I use a multi-factor authentication system that has a 4 or 6 character alphanumeric password along with a fingerprint reader that I can bypass with some Scotch tape, did that really make me more secure than a strong password? Maybe. It depends on the threats that I'm trying to avoid. But it's certainly not the type of strength of security we generally think of when we think of multi-factor. The other problem with multi-factor is that it doesn't necessarily stop all attacks, and so that you really need to consider the attacks that you're trying to prevent, the threats that you're facing when you're designing your authentication program. So take a traditional phishing attack that we see all the time. Set up a great strong multi-factor authentication mechanism for my end users. End user receives a link to a web page. They go to a web page that looks exactly like my application's login. They dutifully enter their username, their strong password. They pull up their app on their phone and enter the token from it, and they hit submit, and then the hackers immediately have all the credentials that they need to turn around it and log in as that end user. It's a pretty common attack that just by declaring multi-factor we don't avoid or we don't get away from. There are ways to defend against this type of attack, but we need to be thoughtful about, is this what we're worried about, and are we willing to invest in the right defense? And so we have Duo as a vendor here. They've got a great adaptive authentication mechanism that they sell. You'll pay for it, it costs, and there's plenty of other vendors that use adaptive auth as well. And they help defend against these types of attacks by changing the number of factors or the types of factors that are going to be required depending on the threats that they see. But that's really what is key when it comes to designing an authentication system. You need to consider your threats. We can't just blindly declare that we're using multi-factor so it fixes all of the issues. Which factors are we using? Why are we using them? Why do we select those? And do they address the threats that we're facing with our systems? And so I'd suggest that a term that's a little bit more descriptive, a little bit more helpful, is actually threat-driven authentication. So if you tell me that you have a multi-factor system, okay, it tells me a little bit. But if you tell me that you have a system that's driven by your threats, then all of a sudden I know you've thought about it. I may not know how secure the system necessarily is. I don't necessarily know what you're using in order to implement the authentication system, but at least I know that you put some thought into the threats that your organization's facing, that your system's facing, and that you've tried to design defenses around those. And I think that level of thoughtfulness is what we need to hold ourselves to as security professionals. We can't just decide that passwords are dead, but the two-factor fixes everything. We need to really be thoughtful about the threats that we're facing and what we want to implement in our organization. So myth number 5, security through obscurity is useless. Another one that I've heard since I first got into the security industry and took for granted when I first started hearing it. But then the more I looked around, the more I started to question that. So this one should be pretty easy to address. If everybody could raise your hand if on your public web page you publish a complete network diagram along with data flows, IP addresses, and server names of your organization. And that's kind of what I thought, that nobody's going to raise their hand to that. But that ultimately is just security through obscurity. We don't actually believe that a determined attacker couldn't gain that information. It's the first steps in the kill chain, and attackers are actually pretty good at gathering that information up. But at the same time, we aren't necessarily going to give it to them. We're going to make their job as hard as we can. We're going to try and slow the attack down. We're going to try and raise their costs. Maybe that gets them to look for another target. Maybe it gives us more time to see that we're being attacked. But regardless, we owe it to ourselves and to our company to go ahead and slow the attacker down. And a little bit of obscurity is effective in that. Another method that sometimes is dismissed by information security professionals as a security measure is a proxy server speed bump. So the speed bump, you may call it something else, but it's basically a page that comes up, and all major proxy servers support it now, when a user goes to an unclassified web page. And it just says, are you sure you want to go to this page? We don't know what this is. And as a security professional, I thought, well, that's silly. Of course end users are just going to click through that. They really don't care care much about security, and so how effective is that as a control? It's meaningless. It's security through obscurity, and it's just slowing them down. But in second thought, first of all, once you implement it, you find that a surprising number of users actually stop and think a little bit about whether or not they want to click through. And so we still see around 50% of click-throughs. And even though that's still a lot of people clicking through to this unknown site, it's a lower attack surface than we would have otherwise. But more importantly, most malware these days, whether it's ransomware or a rat or anything else, as soon as it gets installed, the first thing it's going to try and do is reach out to its command and control server. And a lot of the times, that command and control server is simply an unclassified site out on the internet. And while it's easy for a human to click on that link to go ahead and move on to get the internet access to that page, for a lot of software, it's a little bit more challenging. And so we see a lot of these rats, a lot of this ransomware is not able to get out and talk to the command and control servers that they need to be able to talk to. And so it stops the attack right there. And of course, again, it's not an absolute control. Could you write software that gets around that? Absolutely. Is it happening? I don't know, probably. But if it stops some percentage of it, then it's still in a good control that we need to consider in our arsenal. But the third benefit that we get from a proxy server speed bump is information. So if you see an endpoint calling out to an unclassified site 100, 500 times a day, it's probably not just really a determined end user trying to get to some random site. It's probably a piece of malware on your system. That's a pretty reliable indicator of compromise and something that you absolutely need to be looking into. And so something as simple as a proxy server speed bump actually provides quite a bit of security when we look at it. Can all of that be bypassed? Absolutely. But it still provides value to your organization. And really what it comes down to is layers of defense. Most of the controls we implement, unfortunately, simply aren't 100% effective. Absolutely, your firewall, if you tell it to block a port, it's going to block that port every time. But most of the controls, whether it's antivirus or DLP or anything else that we might implement as a security measure in our environment, it only has degrees of effectiveness. And we fight that fact that it's not fully effective by implementing layered defenses. Okay, so if this isn't going to be fully effective, then we'll use it in combination with additional controls. And obscurity is no different than any of those other controls that aren't fully effective. Absolutely, it can be worked around. Absolutely, it can be bypassed. But used in conjunction with other controls, it's a strong measure to slow down your attacker, maybe divert him to an easier target, and definitely give you more of a chance to find him and identify him and stop him before he gets too far. And so it's all about that kill chain. And then myth number 6. Security theater accomplishes nothing. And so I tried to research this, and the first time I heard the phrase security theater was a Bruce Schneier article soon after the shoe bomber attack. And the phrase may go back earlier, I don't know, but I believe he may have coined it. And he was upset, understandably so, because already long lines at airports after 9/11 became even longer as we had to take off shoes and go through other security mechanisms. And his argument, rightfully so, is that this doesn't help stop terrorism. Actually taking your shoes off and running them through the scanner separately probably isn't being a very effective control at what we were trying to stop, and that a determined attacker is simply going to find other ways to get explosives on board. And all of those were valid points. But the counterpoint to that's brought by Bruce Sandman. And Dr. Sandman is a professional in the crisis management or crisis communications field. And he's done a lot of research here. And he actually takes the formula that we've traditionally used for risk and says that it's not complete. So our traditional formula is that the impact times the likelihood equals our risk score. And he says, well, what you're actually calculating there is the hazard. It's the chances that something might happen. It's the chance that terrorism attack actually comes through. But what it completely ignores is the outrage level. And so we take a look at how the country was in the wake of the shoe bombing attack, and there were a lot of people very upset. There was a lot of nervousness. And the government was doing things about it, but most of those things were behind the scenes. There were investigations, there were policy changes, they were reorganizing our entire defense industry. And so as all that happened, the people that were expressing concern still had no comfort that anything was changing. So the government did something visible. Was it necessarily effective at eliminating the threat? Probably not, I don't know. But certainly what it did do is provide a visible mechanism to let people know that we're doing something, we're watching this, we're trying to protect you. And it made people feel better, and there's value in that. And so I would argue that when you're rating your risk, when you're assessing your risk as part of your risk management process, that you absolutely need to consider the outrage component. It might be that an auditor's identified a risk that you think is really relatively low, and you don't want to be distracted by it. But if your CIO has an interest in it, or anyone else that's watching that audit report, it's probably worth a little bit of your time to go ahead and address that risk so it doesn't become a distraction later. It gets down to the outrage factor. We need to consider it in our risk calculations. And in fact, for all of his frustrations with the security theater, Mr. Schneier did write another article a few years later where, though he didn't quote Dr. Sandman, he referenced very similar arguments in saying that there is a place in our industry for security theater, that there are times when people are so upset that you need to have a demonstrative show that you're actually doing something, even if what you're showing them isn't especially effective. That sometimes we need to address people's fear and outrage factors. And so I think that as a group we should be a little bit less derisive about security theater and consider that it's sometimes needed. And hopefully not often. Certainly we'd all rather focus on the hazard, we'd rather focus on reducing risk as we traditionally see it, but to completely ignore outrage I think is a mistake that we shouldn't make. And so, again, the theme through all of this has been that words matter, that we need to be professionals, and we need to consider the words that we use very carefully, that we need to be willing to question our beliefs, and we need to consider whether or not how we're expressing ourselves is really the message that we want to get across. And so whether it's referring to yourself as a risk professional instead of a security professional, whether it's talking about cyber espionage instead of cyber war, or just being less derisive when it comes to terms like security through obscurity or security theater, and recognizing that those things really can provide benefit to your organization. I think that we need to be very careful about how we talk and how we communicate to people. All right, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.